So welcome, see Joseph, Karen, and Cecilia. I'm Julie Hart. I'm the project coordinator for the Breeding Bird Atlas. And we are, hopefully you have come here by way of advertisement that we've done for the Big Atlas weekend. And that takes place starting tomorrow night at 6. And if you've heard of like a big day event or like the World Series of Birding or something like that, we are basically doing a very similar type of weekend-long competition. But instead of like getting as many species as you can, it's trying to document as many birds exhibiting breeding behaviors. So that's like carrying food or singing or feeding young or a nest or something like that. So that's what the Atlas is all about. And we really want to promote people to pay more attention to breeding birds, particularly in the summer months when a lot of birders kind of step back from birding, and just show people another way to approach enjoying birds and bird life around them. So it's a fun competition. There's, just by submitting one checklist to the Atlas, you'll be entered as for a chance to win a prize. And then we have 7 different categories where people can win a prize. But everyone that participates also gets a free course from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's like an intro bird course, a bird ID course. So there's a lot of stuff in there for you, and it also helps us a lot too. So this is, a 5-year project that we only do once every 20 years. And so we try to cover the entire state, which is a big area, and we need all the help we can get. So we're really glad you're here. And I'm going to let Charlie take over. So Charlie, I work with, I cover the entire state, and then there are about a dozen regional coordinators that are located all across the state. So no matter where you are in the state, there is someone who is pretty close to you, who you can reach out to and ask questions, and they'll be, hosting events and training sessions and walks and things like that too. So Charlie is one of our regional coordinators, and I'll let you introduce yourself, Charlie.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. And I just want to say one way that you can support the Atlas is by buying a Big Atlas Weekend t-shirt. There's all sorts of swag that you can purchase. The Atlas definitely needs money, as Julie will tell you. So I'm going to start to share my screen now. Okay, so hopefully you see a picture right now of American Kestrel and the New York State Breeding Bird Atlas. And I'm going to talk to you tonight about that. I understand there's someone here from North Carolina. It should be very much the same, though, what we're going to talk about. And just to let you know a little bit about myself, my name's Charlie Scheim, and I started birding when I was in college, but just sort of casually. And then I joined DOAS, the Delaware Otsego Audubon Society. I live in upstate New York in Oneonta, which is in Otsego County. And then a few years after that, I enrolled to do the Breeding Bird Atlas #2, which happened in 2000 to 2004. I learned a lot. And right now I'm a coordinator for the Breeding Bird Atlas. I'm also the treasurer of DOAS. I lead a lot of bird walks, usually with my wife, Sandy Bright. That's why it says Charlie and Sandy on my little name window there. And also, just so you know, I'm not an ornithologist. I'm not any kind of a bird scientist or anything like that. I'm just a retired math professor. So when you do a breeding bird atlas, lots of states are doing them. Like I said, North Carolina is doing one. Maryland is doing one. They do them up in Canada. But the goals are generally the same. And the first goal is to show what species are living and breeding in what areas of New York State. That's really, in my mind, the overarching goal. We're looking for birds in the state, and we're looking to find birds that are breeding. And that's important for these other reasons that I've noted down there, like, for example, to understand how bird populations are changing over time, or to help people make decisions about land use, or simply to just get people appreciating birds. And let me just show you an example of how bird species are changing over time. This is New York State's third atlas. These atlases happen every 20 years, and they last for 5 years. The first one was in 1980 to 1984. And this is a picture about the story of bald eagles, which is such a great story in New York State. In the 1980 atlas, as you can see on the left-hand map of New York State, there's little dots on that. Those are the only pairs of bald eagles or bald eagles that were found in the state. And the two dark dots were the only two pairs that were documented as breeding at that time in New York State. They had practically become extinct at that point. The DEC in New York instituted a program to try to bring them back. And you can see 20 years later in the 2000 atlas, there were a lot more dots of where bald eagles were found in the state, and a lot more of those dark dots that indicate where the eagles were actually breeding. And now in the third atlas, 2020 to 2021, just the first 2 years of the atlas, this is what the bald eagle map looks like in New York State. They are really everywhere now. In fact, we have a bald eagle pair that are breeding in a tree behind the Lowe's in our town. You know, they are really just get amazing birds now. You see them everywhere. On the other hand, barn swallows, and in general, avian insectivores, birds that eat bugs on the wing, are having a terrible time. You can see in 1980, barn swallows were just reported everywhere in New York State. They were all over the place, except up here, this is the Adirondacks in New York State. There was not so many up there. In 2000, you could see their numbers were thinning out somewhat, but still, there was quite a lot of them. But now, again, this is only after 2 years of this atlas, but still, you can see there's big areas of the state, like in the western part of New York, a huge area in the Adirondacks, down in the Catskills, where people are not finding barn swallows, and in general, avian insectivores. Sandy and I, my wife, we were up in the Adirondacks last week. We saw, I think, 2 swallows the whole time we were there. It's just too bad. And it's really because of insect populations are declining terribly. You can see that little blurb down at the bottom. 40% of all insects are declining and a third are endangered. This is bad news, not only for birds, but for, of course, pollinating plants and crops and everything else. So there's 2 good examples of why having an atlas is helpful. So now what I want to do is talk to you about what do atlasers do. And I'm going to break it up into 3 sections. First of all, talking about going birding. And then secondly, atlasers observe the birds and their breeding behaviors. And then third, they record their data. So this presentation will break down into those 3 categories. So first of all, let's talk about going birding. And I just want to talk about how the BBA is organized in New York. And this would be similar in North Carolina. The state is divided up into over 5,700 blocks, and the blocks are about 3 miles by 3 miles. The blocks come from the quadrants that have been established by the United States Geological Survey. And just for example, the middle picture here shows Delaware County in New York State, which is near where I live, and it shows all the USGS quadrants in Delaware County. The red is the county borders, and here's the quadrants. And so, like, for example, here's Bloomville, Hobart, Roxbury. And the BBA then takes those quadrants, for example, the Roxbury quadrant, and it breaks it up into 6 pieces. Roxbury Northwest, Northeast, Central West, Central East, Southwest, and Southeast. Every single quadrant in the state gets divided up into those 6 blocks. And then 2 of these blocks, usually the CE and the NW block, are what are called priority blocks. And so I'll show you, here's a picture of blocks near Roxbury. So this is a map from Google Maps with block boundaries superimposed on it. In the red are the priority blocks, Roxbury CE, Roxbury NW. Nearby is Hobart CE, Hobart NW. And then you can imagine, like right here would be Hobart CW, SW, and SE, Southeast. So by this design then, what you see is that about a third of the blocks, 2 out of every 6, are called priority blocks. Now, why are they called priority? It's really because they're going to be used in the future for the random samples that scientists have to have in order to make legitimate scientific conclusions about the data that we're gathering. You need random samples. If everybody only submitted data from their favorite birding spot, well, the data that we get would be really biased. And so it wouldn't be very valuable scientifically. And so the Atlas tries to encourage people to bird in priority blocks. That's not the only place you should bird. You can bird anywhere you want, of course. If you live in, say, Hobart CW, you should bird there, of course. But also maybe spend some time in Hobart CE and Hobart NW. Spend time in priority blocks too. So now I want to talk about this block structure that's happening. When you're atlasing, you should be sure to just include observations from a single block. And so here's a block here. We won't worry about the name of it. You just want to record on that one block. And if you change blocks, you should start a new checklist. So for example, this person here that's following this purple path, maybe they started at the golf course and they're driving along these roads perhaps. When they get to the block boundary, they should stop that checklist. And then if they want to continue birding in that nearby block, that's fine. Just start a new checklist and bird there for as long as you want. Maybe they're driving along more roads. When they get back to the block boundary, they should stop that checklist and start a third one and use that one as they bird along this path. So it's important. This is really one of the fundamental rules in Atlas work, is to just use observations from a single block in a checklist. And also another important thing is to keep your checklist relatively short. Like it says in my notes there, keep track lengths under 5 miles. So for example, this person that did this blue path, they went along here, maybe they're on their bicycle or something, and it was about 6.8 miles. That's just too long, under 5 miles. And really, it's better to keep your checklist maybe about a mile in distance, or say underneath an hour or a half an hour in time. That's way better than long, lengthy checklists. And that's because then the scientists of the future can know more accurately where these birds were observed. That's what this is all about, really. Now, also, when you look at one of these blocks, you can see there's lots of different habitats. Of course, they're not labeled like in my picture here, but you can see them. There's fields right here. There's shrubbery, there's wetlands and a pond over here, residential areas. You should try to visit all the different kinds of habitats within a block and visit them at different times of the year, like say springtime, early summer, late summer, just for example, because different things are happening with birds at different times of years. Some birds nest early, some birds nest late, like for example, goldfinches nest later in the summer. Also, you should keep separate day and night checklists. That turns out to be important. And technically, nocturnal time is defined as starting 20 minutes after sunset and lasting until 40 minutes before sunrise. And so we'll see in the next slide why that's important. So we talk about when does a block get called complete. So what we're going to learn very soon is that atlasers code species according to this coding of possible, probable, or confirmed breeders. And a block is considered a complete if there are at least 55 coded species, and usually in most places you can get it up to 80 without too much trouble. So in my mind as a coordinator, I usually think of 80 as the number that people should shoot for. And 50% of these coded species should be confirmed breeders. That means you've found evidence that lets you know that these birds have bred in that block. Also, there should be about 20 hours of diurnal time and at least 2 hours of nocturnal time. Now, this may not be the case in all states, and in different states, atlases have different rules, they have different setups. And so if you live in a different state, you should check for the completion guidelines in your state. I think in North Carolina, they're much the same as this, except I don't know if they have the nocturnal hours in their requirements. Now, that might sound like an awful lot of work. Don't let that bother you. Anybody can just go to Atlas in any block that you want, whenever you want. And the idea is that your observations will contribute to this gigantic overall data set that's being collected for the state and for that block in particular. You don't have to worry about completing a block. You should just go out and bird. If you want to complete a block, that's fine. You can make that choice. And certain people even let themselves be designated as the principal atlaser for a block. And all that really means is they're going to try to be sure that the block gets completed, but you don't need to do that. So let me just sort of stop here. We've reached one finished point, and let me just ask, are there any questions that anyone wants to ask right now?
Feel free to unmute yourself too. Either put your questions in the chat or just unmute yourself, because we're a small enough group, that's fine.
Yes, that's definitely nice. I don't see any questions in the chat. Okay, so we can go on, and if you do have questions, just write them into the chat or save them and unmute yourself when the next time I ask for questions. That's fine with me. Okay. So now what's up here? There we go. Okay. Now let me tell you just what's happened so far in the New York Atlas. I made this slide up earlier this summer, so the numbers aren't precisely accurate, but that's okay. After 2 years of our Atlas, there's been over 2,600 atlasers that have sent in information. Now that's different than the previous Atlas, the Atlas 2000. It had about 1,400 participants. I think that's probably due to the fact that people are using eBird, which we'll talk about shortly, to submit their sightings. There's been over 300,000 checklists submitted. It's a huge amount of data. Birders in New York have found 294 species so far and confirmed 218 of them. That's really great. But also, that's statewide. And remember, we're really interested in smaller regions like blocks. So let's start to drill down a little bit. Here's a slide that shows you effort hours that have been invested in the various counties in the state. Here's where I live, Otsego County, right, sort of in the middle there, right there. And this graphic is color-coded according to how many hours. The lighter the color, the less the hours. For example, Schoharie County, which is right here, has had just 215 hours invested so far. That's not very much at all. Jefferson County, which is up here along the St. Lawrence River, that's had about 1,900 hours, as you can see. And then Tompkins County. Now, birders know Tompkins County. That's where Ithaca is, where Cornell University, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where the gods of the birding world live. They have invested so far over 13,000 hours in the county. Now, that is kind of wonderful, but you know, if they talk to me as a coordinator, I would say, gee, couldn't you guys go next door, say to Cortland or Schuyler or Yates County? They haven't had anybody come to see them. And we need birders to go all over the state. So I try to encourage people as a coordinator to start exploring places that are a little different than where they might normally go. And you can find out information about where you live by going to the New York State Breeding Bird Atlas website. And here's the URL right there, www.ebird.org/atlasny. Now, so that's important to realize. You're not just going to the eBird site, you're going to ebird.org/atlasny. eBird has a gigantic amount of data, and a subset of that data belongs to the atlas. And so if you did that, you would get a page that looks like this. It has the Breeding Bird Atlas logo right up here in the corner. That's how you know you're in the right place. There's a nice picture there. That's a fledgling grackle. You can tell it's a fledgling because it's got all this fuzziness on it. And right here, that's called the gape. That lets the fledgling's mouth open really wide so that they can accept food from their parents. And so there's lots of stuff that you can find out here. You can submit checklists. You can look at your own eBird statistics and so on. But what I want to talk about right for the moment is this button here, Explore. And so if you click that Explore button, you would go to this page where you can explore either species or explore by regions. And so let's just pretend, let's say that you live in Madison County, New York, which is about an hour north of where I live. And you'd like to know about information for blocks in Madison County. So you could just type Madison into that bubble for Explore Atlas Regions, and you'd get a window that looks like this. Madison County, and it gives, first of all, an overview. There's been over 2,700 checklists submitted in Madison County by 132 atlasers. There are 72 blocks in Madison County altogether. But, you know, this is covered up. How do I get it? There we go. I couldn't see the number there. 23 priority blocks. So the priority blocks, remember we said they'd be about a third of the total blocks, and that's just what this is. 23 is just about a third of 72. Notice there are no complete blocks in Madison County. We'd really like to change that if we could. We'd like to get more people doing birding in Madison County if they live there. Madison County birders have found 170 species so far, and they've confirmed 89 of those as breeders. That's about a little over 50%. So that's good, but still remember, that's county-wide data. We are interested in the blocks. So let's now click on that tab that says blocks, and you would get information for the Madison County blocks. Here's all of the blocks. There's 72 of them. I couldn't fit them all on one page, of course, so I didn't even try. But here they are listed. Just for example, this is Brookfield, CE, CW, NE, and W, SE, SW. And the same thing now for Canastota and so on. And they list a lot of information there. It lists the diurnal hours, the nocturnal hours, the observed species. Those are species that were just seen but not given any code. And then possible breeders, probable breeders, confirmed breeders, and then the total. Notice, like, for example, here, 22 is the sum of these three, 16, 5, and 1. I used to be a math professor. I know these things. So, but now we're really interested, like I said before, we're hoping birders go to the priority blocks. So let's look specifically at those. So if you just click right there on priority, you would get this page. Here are now the 23 priority blocks in Madison County. They're again listed by their diurnal, nocturnal, and so on data. Notice they're all CE or NW, Canastota CE, NW, Cazenovia CE, NW. They all have this little P after them, which says they're priority blocks. And just to check them out a little more, you can order the blocks by any of these categories. And so, for example, if I were to click on the word total, it would reorder the blocks according to the total number of species. And here we can see it. And what I've done is I've kind of split the screen so I can see all 23 blocks at once. These are all the priority blocks. And they're ordered from smallest to largest. The smallest is Morrisville CE with only 9 species. up to West Eaton NW with 108 species. So, you know, if you lived in Madison County and you wanted to do atlasing, you might say, gee, I live near Morrisville. Maybe I should go birding in one of these blocks. Or you might say, Cazenovia, that's not so far away from Morrisville. Maybe I'll go bird there. They haven't seen much action either. That's what I hope the folks will do. They'll start to visit blocks that haven't been visited very much. But if you're just starting out, I say just start birding in the block where you live, you know, whether it's priority or not, to get yourself used to the idea. But let's say you were interested in this Morrisville NW block, just as an example. You can see precisely what information has been recorded for that block by clicking on the name Morrisville NW. And if you click on that, you'll get a page that looks like this. This is the data sheet for the Morrisville NW block. It tells you everything about the block. The block's incomplete. It is a priority block. It has had 0.22 effort hours. Now, when you think about that, 0.22 hours is about 6 or 7 minutes. Nobody's been here. No nocturnal hours at all. There's been 4 checklists submitted from 3 different atlasers. And in fact, here they are right here. The people who submitted the checklist, not many at all. If you wanted to see, if you were in a block that had lots of checklists, you could see them all by clicking right below there where it says more recent visits. And then down below, it shows you all of the species that have been found so far in the block, which, as we said, is only 11. It's not very many. Here it tells you the breeding evidence, like green herons have been called possible breeders in the block. We'll understand what that means very shortly. It tells you where they found them at 4027 East Mile Strip Road, and so on, and when. Okay, so if you're new to atlasing and you're wondering what you should do, this is a way to find out what's been done so far near you and where you might go to do some atlasing. So let me ask now, are there any questions anyone would like to ask? I notice there's a lot more stuff in chat, so let's just see what's there. Okay, so. All right, so this person says Cecilia King is originally from a farm outside Fulton, New York. And she could start atlasing there, perhaps. Let's see about questions. If people have been atlasing and running over boundaries, how is this data used? That is a problem. If you submit data, a checklist that includes more than one block, it really obfuscates what's going on. And so in some sense, I mean, the problem is the checklist just gives the location as being in one place. The person that's reviewing the checklist doesn't really know if you crossed a boundary or not. And you're actually then obscuring the information.
Yeah, I understand that. So what's the best thing for me to tell people that are doing that? Like I myself am going to go back and look at some checklists from certain, you know, either priority blocks or areas I'm interested in, and I may be able to remember my route at certain places, to be honest with you, so I could make it a shorter distance. But it's going to show the tracking data still.
That's right.
So it's useless then to do that. But
So,
should we just take it out of the running?
No,
So-
that's not necessary. Go ahead, Julie.
Sorry. I'm like, yeah, so if you go in and you edit your checklist and you change the track, you can edit the track.
You can edit the track? Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, in the mobile app you can, yes. But even if you didn't do that, so I don't actually, we don't actually get the tracks. So we can't see that. We don't know that.
Okay.
Right. So that's why it's so important.
So I see. So if you start on the edge of one and go into another and do all your birding in the other one, it's going to look like it's all in the first one, correct?
Right, it'll
That's right.
all look wherever, because you end up selecting one point location for along that route.
Okay.
And wherever that point location is, all of the data for that checklist will go to that block. And so that is where it becomes problematic. So for example, we have, there's these like sandhill cranes that breed right on the border with New Jersey. And last year they actually bred in New Jersey. And so we could tell like who was doing a checklist, like crossing the state boundary and not starting new checklists, because we could see, oh, you like have that sandhill crane nest. And we know you went into New Jersey, but most of the time we can't really tell.
All right.
So there's a couple solutions. One, like you said, if you can remember where your route was and you can
Yeah, I
remember,
mean, I can take care of my own stuff, but you know, I've encouraged people to do this. A bunch of us have encouraged people to do it, but they're doing it really totally incorrect, even worse than me.
yeah.
And I just start, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I couldn't Atlas the last couple of years because of issues. But I can now, and I'm really excited to do that. But I also have this data that I'm not overly proud of because I wasn't really keeping up with it. So I'm gonna try to massage that somehow myself.
Yeah. So and if you can't massage the data, then the best thing is to move it out of the portal, and then just, we still have 2.5 years. So hopefully those gaps will be, that those data will be made up. In terms of the other people that you know of that are doing it wrong, I would recommend contacting the regional coordinator in your area, which you're out west, right?
I'm in Greece. Is it Greg or Andrea? Who's regional?
Andrea, Andrea,
Is more west. I'm Greece,
Mike
New York.
Morganti, Mike Morganti and Sue Barth are the three out in that area.
For Rochester? Yeah, okay.
Mhm.
For Braddock
Well,
Bay, for instance.
Rochester,
Who's Braddock Bay? I live near Braddock Bay.
that's Andrea. Mhm.
That's what I thought. Yeah, okay.
Yep. Yeah, so if you let her know, then she can reach out to people, and sometimes just having that little bit extra like authority.
Right. No, I mean, I think I'm just gonna, the ones that were doing it, just say, get out of the portal, just start doing all your mobile stuff outside the portal if you're not gonna play the game. So, I mean, there are people that bird every day, so you're gonna have a lot of bad data. That's all that I don't know what they even can do with that. It's gonna really be a problem. So.
Mhm.
Now,
Yeah.
also, I just want to tell you that as you're using eBird, eBird will warn you as you're approaching a block boundary. Comes a little message that says approaching a block boundary. And so that's a good signal to you.
That's very useful, yes.
Stop a checklist and then start a new one as you cross
That
the boundary.
wasn't in place the first year though.
No, that's right. It's a recent update to eBird. That's right.
That's a fantastic thing. Yes, it is.
Yes.
Yeah,
And also you can look at the eBird map in eBird, and it will show you the block boundaries too. And it will show you your little blue GPS dot. And so you can also see as you're getting near a boundary too. But the warning is very useful.
What was that, Google Maps? I can do that in? Is that what you said?
No, in eBird.
Oh,
in the app.
Yeah, in the
got a
eBird
little
mobile
blue
app,
GP. Yeah.
you can click, there's a little icon for the map. And if you click on that, it will show you the block boundaries and your
okay.
GPS spot.
Okay. I haven't found that yet. I'll find it.
Okay. And I've been looking through the chat and see people are from all over the state, and that's really great. I encourage you to go atlasing. If you're a beginner, start small. If you're an experienced birder, we'll talk about using eBird in just a few minutes, but if you're already an experienced birder that is using eBird, all you have to do is change the portal and you can start atlasing. So you'll see all of that very shortly. But one more question says, suppose you bird in your yard many days and know when a bird fledges and basically have, say, one pair of cardinals, how many days or weeks should you retain the fledgling status? My kind of rule of thumb is that if the young are still dependent on the adult, then they should be coded as fledglings. But as soon as they're independent enough to feed themselves, protect themselves, and so on, they've lost that fledgling status and they shouldn't be recorded anymore. And that's mostly because at that point, when they can fly, well, they may have come from another block, right? They may have flown in from the NE block into the NW block, for example. And so the data wouldn't be as accurate. So as long as the birds are still dependent on the adults, I think that's a fair thing to do then. And I see there's one more message here. Does it show priority blocks in the app? No, it doesn't. It just shows you block boundaries. And you have to know then which block you're in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So CC, I don't know, but most likely in North Carolina, there should be like a KML file that you can download and put into either Google Maps or Gaia or Venza or one of those other apps. That's what I do here. I made a KML file with just the priority blocks, and then I use we use the other apps to see the priority blocks near you. And there was one other question Lynn asked about BOS. And then, okay, and Joseph has a question now too. So for BOS, I don't know exactly how they're splitting it up, but on that link, if you scroll down to the bottom, there's a sign up button. And I assume that emails Andrea, Sue, and Mike. And so I'm assuming that they're going to divvy it up ahead of time that way, but I don't know for sure actually, but I would do that. And how do you...
So maybe I'll move on now and talk about the breeding codes, if that's okay. All right.
Yep.
Okay, so here we go. So, okay, so this comes to the second part of what atlasers do. All birders observe the birds, but atlasers also observe their breeding behaviors. And there are really 4 categories. I've mentioned 3 of them so far: confirmed, probable, possible, and the first one is just observed. And let's talk about that one first. Observed birds are not actually included in the atlas data. And so, for example, if you saw a cardinal at your bird feeders in the wintertime, so now that wintertime is not breeding season for cardinals. And if birds are present, but there's no evidence of breeding, or they're outside of their breeding season, then you just record them as observed. You don't put any code into eBird, and it will just automatically be recorded as observed. Or for example, let's say you see a sandhill crane flying overhead, but it's just flying clearly just in some kind of flight. It doesn't look like it's going to be landing anywhere nearby anytime soon. That's called a flyover. And so in your list, as you record sandhill crane, you would give it a code of F. And we'll see how to do that in eBird when we get to the eBird section. But a flyover is, again, just a bird that falls into this observed category. Those are the only 2 observation kind of things. We're really interested in possible, probable, and confirmed breeding. And possible is exactly what all birders do. All birders go out and they find birds, like they find a Carolina wren in a bush. That's an adult in suitable nesting habitat. That's just what you do. You look for birds, you identify them. And so by Carolina wren in your list, you would give it a code of H for inappropriate habitat. Or if you know bird songs, which is a terribly useful thing to know, if you're walking through the woods and you hear a scarlet tanager, you can give that bird an S code, S for singing bird. And so those are the things that birders do all the time. And so if you bird regularly, you could be contributing to the atlas right now. You could be finding lots of possible species in Morrisville, NW, just for example, that only somehow people have only noticed 9 species so far. That's just not really possible. And one thing to just notice, this is something to say, all observations except for the H should be coded any time of the year. And in general, what the atlas says is you should code what you observe, when you observe it, and where you observe it. So just for example, if this Carolina wren was singing in the bush in February, that's not breeding season, but if it's actually singing and not just making random sounds, then that bird should be given a code of S, even though it's clearly not in its breeding season. And in the end, the scientists in the atlas and in eBird will weed out any sightings that are actually considered inappropriate. But you know, with climate change, breeding habits are changing. We know that some birds are breeding earlier than they used to. And so if you say, well, I shouldn't record this bird because it's not in its breeding season, well, we don't actually know that. And that's the information that we're collecting in the atlas. So those are the only two categories in possible breeders. But for example, let's say that you heard a meadowlark or saw a meadowlark in a field one day, and then you went back a week later and saw a meadowlark there in the same place. And that meadowlark was singing again. That bird is now coded as S7, singing bird present 7 days. That moves it to a probable. So in other words, it's now fair to say that meadowlarks are probably breeding in this block, and that is really good information. Or it happens plenty of times when we go out birding, in almost any block, if there's one red-winged blackbird, there's 5,000 of them, right? So it'll be very common that you might hear easily more than 7 red-winged blackbirds singing. You should then code that as M, multiple singing birds in one block. And this can be recorded in a block over the course of the entire breeding season. So not just on one visit, but 2, 3, 4, 5 visits. If you encounter the same species singing in different areas of the block 7 times, code it as an M. And that says this species is probably breeding in this block. Or maybe you go out birding and you see a pair of hooded mergansers in a pond near you. There's a pair in suitable habitat. Pair, male and female, of course. They get coded with a P for pair. Or you might see one male chasing another, for example. Or going back to red-winged blackbirds, you see this all the time with them. They are such aggressive birds. You always see male red-winged blackbirds chasing either other males or other species. Those birds are defending their territory, or they're defending their intended mate. They don't want other males to mate with this female by fighting or chasing. That's called territorial defense. Those birds get coded with a T, and that species is now a probable breeder in the block. Or for example, I mean, this has probably happened to everybody here. You're driving down the road and you see turkeys in a field and they're displaying, right? Like this guy here, he's all puffed up. His body is all puffed up. His tail is all fanned out. That bird is trying to attract females. He's displaying. Or, you know, even at your backyard bird feeder, you might see a male cardinal take a seed and approach a female. The female starts fluttering her wings, which indicates that she's receptive to this male, and he then feeds her the seed. That's part of courtship of certain species, where the male feeds the female. It's telling the female, because when juvenile birds are begging for food, they often flutter their wings. If the male responds to that wing fluttering, that means he's probably going to be a good providing mate. Or remember in my picture at the beginning, when we were talking about what do atlases do, and there were those 2 kestrels that were copulating. That again falls under this C category for courtship, display, or copulation. It's also probable that you've seen bluebirds, for example, visiting nest boxes or maybe tree swallows. And you'll see one male, say, fly up to a box and look inside. He flies away. Maybe the female flies over, looks in the box and flies away. Those birds are visiting probable nest sites. It can happen out in the wild too. Bluebirds and swallows, for example, nest in tree cavities. Long before there were bird boxes, there were tree cavities, and they nested there. and they would visit probable nest sites. Or even birds that nest in shrubs, like for example, common yellowthroat. You might see the male go into the shrub, come back out, maybe a couple of minutes later, come back into that shrub, come back out. That male is probably visiting a probable nest site and should be coded with an N for visiting probable nest site. Now, there are a bunch more probable codes. If I tried to tell you about every single one, this presentation would take such a long time, you wouldn't like it. So I'll just say, you can find a full list of all these codes if you go to the About tab on the BBA website. Instead of Explore, go to About, and you can find stuff about breeding codes. Now let's talk about how do you confirm breeding. Now, some folks just have the wrong idea. They think, oh, if I have to confirm breeding, I need to find a nest. Not true. There are lots of other behaviors that confirm that a species is breeding. Just for example, you might see a little troop of goslings walking through the grass, right? That tells you right there that Canada geese have bred in that block. And so that'll be a confirmed behavior, and we'll see how these work. One of them that's really common to see, I never, ever realized this as a casual birder until I started doing atlas work. Birds carry stuff. And when birds, like for example, this field sparrow's carrying a few blades of grass, or maybe you'll see a blue jay carrying a stick, or an eagle carrying a bigger stick maybe, those birds are carrying nesting material. They don't just pick stuff up and carry it around for no reason. In fact, that activity is inspired by their hormones that are now going because of the breeding behaviors, that are the breeding procedures that are going on. If you see a bird carrying nesting material, that confirms that that species is breeding in the block. We see that very often. Or you might be lucky and see an osprey flying up to its nest box with a bunch of nesting material in its claws. That bird is actually now building its nest. And so that gets coded as NB. Notice these two codes, CN and B, they have two letters, whereas all the previous codes like singing was an S or courtship was a C, they just had one letter. The confirmed codes all have two letters, so it's easy to pick them out right away. So these birds are nest building. Now, you do have to be careful, try to be thoughtful as you see this stuff. For example, certain species like wrens and woodpeckers, they build what are called dummy nests. A male house wren, for example, might start putting nesting material into 3 or 4 different nest boxes on your property. That bird is building dummy nests. And what it hopes is that the female will come along and say, oh, I like this one. Let's start a family right here. And that'll happen. Or also, maybe it will keep out other males from trying to occupy those boxes. Woodpeckers do the same thing. And so this code NB doesn't apply to wrens and woodpeckers because they build these dummy nests. There is a code in the probable category, one that I didn't tell you about, that applies to that situation. Or, like we said before, you might find recently fledged young that still are dependent on their parents. Goslings here, or maybe you'll find, for example, you might be out and see a family of chickadees. One is the adult, 3 others maybe are the young. They'll all be fluttering their wings and making all kinds of little begging sounds. They're begging their parents to feed them because they haven't quite figured out how to feed themselves yet. They're still dependent on the parents. And so they would get coded with FL, recently fledged young. Or another fairly common thing to see is a bird carrying food. Now, when birds are foraging for food for themselves, when they find it, they eat it. You know, if a chickadee finds a caterpillar and it's going to eat it, it eats it right then. Or maybe if it gets scared off by you or a predator or something, it might fly off to another branch, but then it's going to eat it. But if you see a bird carrying food, it's carrying it for one reason, and that's to feed its young. For example, it's so common to see a robin on your front lawn, hopping around, gathering up some bugs, and pretty soon it has 3 or 4 bugs in its mouth already. That bird is gathering food so it can take it back to the nest and feed the young. And so that gets coded CF, carrying food. That confirms then that this species is breeding in the block. Once again, you do have to be careful. For example, corvids, blue jays, crows, ravens, or raptors like hawks or falcons, they do carry food in other situations. For example, blue jays cache food for later use. But if you see a blue jay carrying a worm, it's not going to cache a worm because that's not a very storable object. It will just dry up and lose its nutritional value. They might store seeds. So you should be a little bit cautious about that, but still the Atlas rules apply. Code what you see, when you see it, and where you see it. So if you see a bird carrying food, code it as carrying food in the block when you see it. You might, I saw this just today with exactly this same species at our bird feeders at our house. I saw a male house sparrow feeding its young. It happens a lot. You'll see it pretty often. And like I said, the young will flutter their wings and make a lot of squawking little sounds, begging for food. They call them begging young. And so the adults will feed them because the young don't know how to feed themselves. Or you might see, this is pretty neat, I never knew about this until I started doing the Atlas back in 2000. When baby birds are born, they of course don't have diapers. If they excreted their waste, they would just foul the nest. And so what actually has happened is they excrete their waste in a little membrane, and that's called a fecal sac. And then the adult takes the fecal sac, carries it away from the nest and drops it. So if you see an adult flying along with a little white thing in its beak hanging down, it's carrying a fecal sac. That confirms that that species, a house wren in this picture, for example, is confirmed for the block. Or finally, the holy grail of confirmations, if you can find a nest with eggs or a nest with young, well, there's definite confirmation right there that the species has bred. But like I said, these are not very common. I think in my birding life, I've found out in the wild nests with eggs maybe 3 or 4 times. It's just, it doesn't happen very often, at least not for me. Maybe for other, more experienced birders, that might be the case, but not for me. We did just find on our trip to the Adirondacks a junco nest with eggs in it, but it doesn't happen very often, except of course for like robins on your windowsill in the window box with a nest, then you'll see the eggs or the young. So this is how you would confirm birds, confirm breeding. And so then now you know how to code birds into 3 categories, either possible, probable, or confirmed. And remember, we're looking for about 50% of all the species that you code to be confirmed breeders. So let me just ask now, are there any questions that anyone wants to ask? Let's see, anything in the chat?
I have one.
Go right ahead.
If, say, we have seen eggs that have been recently hatched in like a path or something of that nature, would that be listed as confirmed, or what would that be considered?
Yes, that would probably be called fledgling. For example, when Sandy and I were up in the Adirondacks last week, we found several families of ruffed grouse. So what happened is we were walking down a path, and all of a sudden you start hearing this rustling in the weeds right beside you. You can suddenly see these little baby grouse scurrying away, and oftentimes the adult female grouse comes right out and gets your attention, trying to draw your attention away from the babies. But yes, if you find young birds walking along in a path like that, that still look like they're probably dependent on their parent, that would be coded as FL, recently fledged birds.
I meant so as like, do you just see eggshell?
Yeah.
Oh, eggshells. Okay, that's a different story. Go ahead, Julie.
Yeah, Generally, you can't code eggshell fragments because there are a lot of predators that will carry an egg pretty far from the nest. So like a crow or something could carry it pretty far from the nest, and then it would be outside of the block that it was originally in. Plus, it can be really hard to identify an egg just from a partial egg. Hard to identify the species from just part of an egg. So yeah, so most cases you can't code just an eggshell.
Okay, I figured, just thought I'd ask. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's, when I started atlasing, I remember asking the same question because I found eggshells and I knew they were from robins, and I thought, oh, this must confirm robins breeding, but they said, no, that doesn't work. So it's too bad, but no. Any other questions that folks would like to ask? Okay. Now, there's lots more information about breeding codes. Once again, go to that website, ebird.org/atlasny. You can also, there's a Facebook group, New York Breeding Bird Atlas discussion group on Facebook. I'm actually a moderator on that group. People contribute lots of interesting observations. They ask lots of interesting questions about, hey, I saw this. How can you code that? And it's a good place to get information from. Also, I'm perfectly happy, even though you may live far away from me, if you want to send me an email or text me or something and ask me questions, I'm fine with that. I can send you lots of information, instructions on how to, for example, get digital maps of a block, or how to use eBird more carefully or whatever, or what kind of breeding codes you might need. I'm glad to answer those kind of questions for you. And in general, your regional coordinators, wherever you might live, will be glad to answer those kind of questions, or perhaps meet with you personally or in a group and help you figure these things out. So any other questions?
Karen has a question. She's still not sure how to find out what block you're in.
Okay, so go ahead, Julie.
Well, and I just want to mention, Charlie, that I did put a couple of links in the chat too, but it's either I can answer or you can answer with keeping that in mind.
Yeah, so what I use the links that Julie has put there. There's this one KML file that she had that can be superimposed on Google Maps. And it shows all the priority blocks in the whole state, and it will show your little blue GPS dot. And that locates you then in whatever block it is. Or you can go to the Breeding Bird Atlas website and look at what's called the Atlas Effort Map, or the interactive block map. There are two maps that let you locate your town, and then that will tell you then which block you actually happen to live in. Those are two of the ways. You can also download digital maps from the Atlas website, the interactive block map. Julie's probably putting in links right now for that.
Oh, good.
And you can download those maps, and then you can actually put them on your phone using an app like Avenza or Gaia, and you can then see the map on your phone in real time as you're out in the field. And the good thing is you don't need cell service. And I live in Delaware, Otsego County. I bird a lot in Otsego and Delaware County. There are so many places, entire towns, that just don't have any cell service at all. And so it doesn't matter to me because my phone will just show me where I am because of the GPS. So those are various ways that you can do that. And I'm happy to help you in particular work out where you are, what block you're in and so on. If you contacted me by email or whatever, I can help you out more individually too. So I hope I answered your question. Anything you want to say, Julie?
I put a little more information exactly with instructions for where to download the KML, and that page that I linked to does provide some instructions for different applications that you can use to see your location in respect to the block boundaries as well. And then there's one question, Cece, you asked how often eBird is updated, and that your eBird shows 0 observations despite you submitting observations for a couple of months. So I'm not sure what's happening there, because it should be updated almost in real time. So your My eBird page should show all your records really like as soon as you submit them. There is up to a 1-day delay for some of the pages that are on the Atlas website. So you may not always see your observations show up on like a block list right away, but you should see your own observations right away. So yeah, if you can ask Scott, that, yeah, hopefully he can help you out with that.
One problem that we're going to talk about now is that might be happening to you is if you're not using the correct portal for your eBird submissions. It's important, for example, people in New York State have to use the New York Breeding Bird Atlas portal. And in North Carolina, it must be the North Carolina Breeding Bird Atlas portal. And if you're just using the general eBird portal, your data is going to eBird, but not to the North Carolina or New York Atlas. So let me just move right on now to talking about eBird. So I just always have this little spiel that I do because I know people of a certain age, which is my age, are resistant to using eBird. And so I always think, I mean, 20 years ago, if you were going to drive somewhere, how did you get there? Well, you took the map out of the glove compartment in the car and you sort of tried to figure out how to get there, right? But nobody does that now. Instead, they use GPS in their car or on their phone. It's way easier to do it that way. And so nobody bothers using paper maps unless you're in certain special circumstances. Well, it's the same thing now with birding too. 20 years ago, you would write down all of your observations on a little piece of paper. Maybe you'd take that home and put it in a notebook and then transfer that to some log that you kept. That doesn't need to happen anymore. There are electronic apps like eBird that will record your data. And we in the Atlas need people to use eBird. That's a definite requirement. If you keep your lists on paper, somehow they have to get to eBird, whether it's by you or someone else, they have to get to eBird. And I'm going to talk about eBird, but I just want to say, if you simply Google get started with eBird, you'll come to a page that has all kinds of stuff like how you create an account. You can take an eBird's Essentials course and so on. Lots and lots of information. eBird is not hard to use. I have talked to lots and lots of people, individuals. I'll talk to them for about a half an hour, help them use eBird. When they're done, they say, this isn't so hard. And it's true, it's not hard at all. And we want to learn how to do it. So you can enter your data into eBird in 2 ways, either on your phone using the eBird mobile app or online on the web by your laptop computer or something like that. I'm going to talk mostly about using your phone, but using it on the computer is much the same. And I'll talk about some of the differences. And of course, there's both Androids and iPhones. They're actually much the same in their display, but I've tried to put them both side by side so that you can see them. And the most important thing that you need to do, and this is what I was mentioning before, is you need to set the Atlas portal. So you're going to go to the settings on your phone. So first of all, of course, you've downloaded the eBird mobile app and you've signed up for an account. Let's assume that's true. Now you go to the settings on your phone, and when you click the settings, you'll see portals. And when you click the portals option, you'll see there's a ton of portals in eBird. All kinds of the main bird atlas and the Mass Audubon eBird and so on. You want to get down to the New York Breeding Bird Atlas. don't accidentally click the New Zealand bird atlas, just for example, right? New York breeding bird atlas. So what that does is it tells eBird the data that's being submitted from this phone should be routed to the New York bird atlas data set rather than just the general eBird data set. So once you've set the portal, and this did happen to me, I had been talking to someone and showing them how to set the portal, and I was using my own phone and I forgot to set it back to the New York breeding bird atlas portal. And then I did a couple of checklists and I thought, hey, my checklist data is not showing up in eBird. What's wrong? And I spent half an hour trying to figure out what was wrong. And I finally realized I didn't have the portal set correctly. And so that's why I was suggesting that one thing to check if your data is not showing up is make sure you actually have the correct portal chosen. Once you do, the eBird starting screen will show it right there. For example, say portal, New York breeding bird atlas. If you're just in the general eBird portal, that doesn't appear on your phone. And so that's a good thing to notice. And so what's going to happen usually is when you start the eBird app, you'll come to this first page, either in your Android or in your iPhone. And all you have to do is click Start Checklist. I just want you to notice, though, Julie was talking about recording your track. Here's the button right here for recording your track. Just make sure that's turned on. You don't have to worry. It's not like everybody can see where you go birding. That track is private. Only the eBird scientist people can access that data. And in fact, at this point, I believe, Julie can correct me if I'm wrong, but they actually can't even figure out where exactly the track is. And that leads to the problem that Lynn was talking about, where people cross boundaries and nobody can know that that happened. So let's say you're starting your checklist and you're going birding. And let's say, just for example, we encounter two catbirds while we're birding. One of them is in a bush and it's just doing its little catbird singing songs. The other one, though, happens to be carrying food. Okay, so we want to enter that into eBird. And so right up here where it says number, species, name, code, you should put in, you can type in 2 gray catbirds, because that's the official name, or you can abbreviate things. You could use the banding code 2GRCA for gray catbird, the first 2 letters of gray, first 2 letters of catbird. Or you can even just type in things like 2 gray or 2 cat, and eBird will then show you all the possibilities. So for example, if you typed in 2 gray, it might show 2 gray catbirds, it might show gray cheek thrush, or it might show black-throated gray warbler, whatever birds have gray in their name. You would then just pick the one you want, gray catbirds. So you click on that, and then you'll get a little window that looks like this. It says gray catbird. 2, if you made a mistake, you can change that number right here. And if you're just a birder and you're just recording stuff in eBird, you're done. And you would just click done here or done in the eBird iPhone one. And that's all you're going to do. That's all birders do. But atlasers do one more step. See the window here? It says breeding code. We want to make sure we add a breeding code here. And so you would click that. And when you do click that, you'll get a window that shows a whole bunch of little buttons, each one labeled with a breeding code on it, like F, flyover, H, habitat, S, singing, or like C for courtship, or N, visiting probable nest site, or nest building, or feeding young, and so on. There's all the codes, even the ones that I didn't tell you about because of time. And you pick the one you want. Now, so let's think back. We had these 2 catbirds. One was singing, which says catbirds are possible. The other catbird was carrying food. That way better, right? It confirms catbirds. We say it's a stronger code. And so you always choose the strongest code you have. In this case, you'd choose carrying food. And these buttons are listed in order of increasing strength. So H and S are weak ones, increasing strength all the way up to CF. FY is stronger than CF. FS, carrying a fecal sac, is stronger than that, and so on. and Y is the strongest code. You should always pick the strongest code for the species in that checklist that you found. So we click carrying food. Now it says it right there. Catbird, 2 of them, CF carrying food. Notice the words are there. So if you forget what the letters stand for, you can just start clicking buttons and you'll eventually see the words that tell you the one that you want. So you click carrying food, and now in your checklist, it'll say 2 gray catbirds, CF. And now, if you were going along and you later found, say you got really lucky and you found a catbird nest with eggs, you would just enter in another catbird and you'd change the breeding code to NE because that's a stronger breeding code. In any checklist, as you encounter stronger codes, record the stronger code, but don't record weaker codes because you want the strongest one there is. And so let's say now you've been birding for a while. You have all these birds that you have observed. You found 2 mourning doves and decided they were actually a pair. You found a red-bellied woodpecker. It was in habitat, a downy woodpecker. Now, woodpeckers, of course, they don't sing a song, but they drum on tree trunks. And that drumming, singing is really the sounds that the bird makes to attract a mate. And so woodpeckers drum on trunks of trees to attract a mate or to defend their territory. And so that's called singing. And so anyway, we've gone along, we filled in all of these birds with their codes. We're ready to stop the checklist. So astoundingly, you click the button that says stop checklist. And eBird will say, do you really want to stop? And you should say, yes, stop the track. You come to a final page where you have to enter a bit more information. You have to choose a location. When you click this, you would get a list of all the possible locations that you might choose, or you'll also get a map. And you can just long press on that map to indicate a location on the map that way. Notice it also tells you the portal. And be sure that it says New York Breeding Bird Atlas. Notice right below portal, like on the left-hand phone, it says stationary. On the right one, it says traveling. There are 3 basic type of checklists: traveling, stationary, or incidental. Traveling is when you're moving along, walking, canoeing, driving, whatever, while you're birding. eBird will keep track of how long you've been doing that, 24 minutes in this case, and how far you went, 0.13 miles. This little icon right here, that's the eBird map icon. That's the icon that you can click on to see your track and to see block boundaries, by the way. But if you say are birding from your backyard deck and you're just sitting on your deck observing all the birds, that's a stationary count. You're definitely birding, but you're not moving around. That's stationary. eBird knows you've been stationary by your GPS, so it doesn't even list a distance. It just says you've been doing that for 6 minutes. Okay. Or the third thing that might happen is maybe you're like driving to the grocery store, but you see on a tree a pair of red tails, male and female. They're sitting side by side. Maybe they're even grooming each other or something. You want to record that data. You stop, you put in an eBird thing that says, I got a pair of red tails. That's an incidental report. And so that would be the third option. And so clicking that little downward triangle, like right here by the traveling in the right-hand phone, that will give you the different options. And those are the 3 main ones. There are others, like if you're out to sea on a pelagic sea coast thing or something, but I don't do that very often, and probably most people don't. Also, if you're in a group and you have more than one observer, you can just click this little person icon and that will increase the number, 2, 3, 4, of how many people there are. And if you do that, eBird will also ask you if you want to share the checklist with those people. And if you click that, it will let you enter in their eBird usernames and it will send the checklist to those people as well. Then finally, and this is a very important thing to answer, is are you submitting a complete checklist of the birds you were able to identify? Now notice, this doesn't say, could you identify every bird you encountered? It might be that you heard birds that you didn't know what the songs were. or you saw a bird flying by, it was a kind of a large dark bird, but you didn't really know what it was, or you saw an accipiter that you couldn't really decide if it was a sharpshin or a cooper. Those are birds you were not able to identify. But as long as you've included every bird that you were able to identify, then you should answer yes. And really, this is what eBird wants. They want complete checklists. Because if you're deliberately not including birds, like maybe you said to yourself, oh my God, I have seen so many robins, I'm not even going to bother writing them down anymore. Well, you know, the absence of data is data, right? What that says is this person didn't encounter any robins on the trip. Instead, the better approach is to enter robins and enter some number for them and then be done with it. Then you've identified all the birds. I mean, submitting a checklist that has all the birds you're able to identify, click yes, it's a complete checklist. If you're not doing that, then you have to click no. And eBird will be sad. And so finally, you're done. I just want you to notice, you don't need cell service either to make an eBird checklist. The only time you need cell service is when you're going to choose the location and then click continue to submit. And so if you are somewhere where you don't have cell service at the moment, you can just click that X here or there, and that will just close the checklist. It won't delete it. It will store it in a list of unsubmitted checklists. And then when you get home or when you get somewhere where you do have service, you can then reopen the checklist and then pick the location and submit it. So don't let thinking that you live in a place where there's no cell service keep you from doing eBird checklists. It does not need to do that. Okay. So I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I'm glad to keep answering questions or chatting about whatever it is you'd like to chat about. Also, your regional coordinators can definitely help you out, and you can find them. You can go to that eBird webpage, and under the About tab is Meet the Atlas team, and all of the regional coordinators are listed right there, and you can contact them that way. So let's just look through the chat, see if there are any questions. Okay.
So
Go ahead.
remind me again why we think that we're going to complete this in 5 years. There's just so many blocks that have like nowhere near 50%.
That's
or
true,
whatever.
and that's been true in every atlas. You know, people say, "Oh, the last atlas, it was so great. We got so many completed blocks." They didn't. When you look at the data, they didn't have many blocks at all that had
I know.
50 or even 40%. But it's what you try for, you know. And if you don't get there, you don't get there. But that's a goal to set. On the
Oh,
other
you
hand,
definitely. Already you have more data than from the previous one. I'm pretty
that's
sure.
right. That's right. We have a lot more data. And you know,
So-
the other thing too is to think about your time. Let's say that you have found 80 species and you had 38 confirmations, right? So here's the question. Is it worth it spending the next 10 hours in that block trying to find 2 more confirmations, or going to another block that has nothing and adding more data? To me, it's more worth it to go to the other block. You're close to 50%. That's the goal. So that would be my thought. Julie might not agree. I don't know, but
Well, she's not in
agree.
agreement. She's in
I
agreement.
do agree. I do agree. Yeah.
yeah.
And Cece asked a follow-up question. What if there aren't 80 species that live there? And yeah, that's I think that's kind of an average for most of New York State. Gets 70 to 90 species, I'd say, breeding on average. But some areas like in New York City and on Long Island, you'll be lucky to get that 55 species.
Or sparsely visited places like in the Adirondacks. You know, it's hard to get 50 or 60 species in a block in the Adirondacks because there's just not that many people that go to those blocks. So
And it's not very,
fewer.
and the habitat is very uniform in the Adirondacks too.
Right,
So
that's
yeah,
right.
it's so the target number of species for us in New York is very contingent upon habitat diversity and availability and what land is actually accessible to. And so that's where it's a little bit fuzzy, and we do leave it up to the regional coordinators and myself to say, oh yeah, this one's done, move on to the next block.
Celia asked a question in the chat that I think is useful to just talk about. She mentions Merlin. Merlin is a very useful app if you don't know about it. It's the app that's put out by Cornell. Originally, it was just for identifying birds by sight. You could answer questions about your sighting and they would help you figure out the bird. But now there's a sound identification app too. It's really useful for helping you become aware of what might be around you. On the other hand, though, it's not really kosher to just have a bird identified by Merlin and then you put it in your list. You know, in the same way, I mean, eBird frowns on using, for example, pictures from a trail cam. You know, they're not things that you have actually observed. It's really the same thing as just using Merlin and not in some way verifying that you personally have actually encountered that bird. But you could, for example, listen to the sound on Merlin and then maybe listen to it on another app and then say, oh, now I hear that sound because I know what I'm listening for. You know, that would be a perfectly legitimate thing to do. So Merlin is a great tool and we use it all the time, and I think everybody should use it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, are there any other? Okay, I see. So any other questions that folks want to ask? Okay, well, thanks for attending, everybody. I enjoy doing these presentations and I'm glad, I hope I was able to help you figure things out. And like I said before, and I'll repeat it, if you want to contact me by email or by texting or something, I'm happy to try to answer your questions that way. For more local people, I actually go out and meet with them and talk to them and maybe help them do a little Atlas bird walk or something, but I don't usually drive to Steuben County, just for example.
Well, thank you very much. I've
You're
learned a
welcome.
lot, and this is the second one in the last couple of weeks I've attended, and I'm learning. I'm definitely learning a lot very quickly, and it does help that I've already been kind of using it, but not correctly,
Yeah.
because now I can go back and fix a few things. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Great.
You know, as a teacher, I always used to believe that students have to do things to learn them rather than me just telling them about them. You know, and it's the same
yeah.
thing with this. The more you use eBird, the better you come to understand it. And then your questions will really have some meaning for you too. So,
Thank you. Have
Thank
fun this
you.
weekend, people. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you for all your help and for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you.